Welcome. My name is Tim Dixon. I want to welcome you to the Pharmaceutical Industry Labor Management Association's Labor Industry Insights webinars, a series of programs where we examine the relationship between the biopharmaceutical industry and North America's skilled craft unions. First, a little bit about PILMA. For nearly 20 years, the Pharmaceutical Industry Labor Management Association has been at the center of collaboration between skilled craft unions and innovative biopharmaceutical companies. Our members are members of the North America's Building Trades Unions, Police and Firefighting Unions, and America's biopharmaceutical companies. At the core of this relationship is one central mission. How do we help create opportunities for a skilled union construction worker in this industry? What policies do we pursue to ensure the innovation economy can put the safest, best trained, most productive workers in the world on the job site so that the world's most innovative scientists and best researchers in the world can bring new medicines and new cures for Americans and to Americans and for people all over the world. Now, last year, this came into sharp focus. We saw severe challenges to the world's health and our economy throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. Through the course of this, the biopharmaceutical industry, along with their union construction worker partners, rose to the occasion and at a record pace brought new vaccines and treatments to the battle against COVID-19. Through it all, union construction workers deemed essential worked to stand up research facilities to develop these treatments and vaccines. In this undertaking, the backhoe operator and the welder have played an important role to help saving the world nearly as much as the researcher and the lab technician. In fact, the number of projects and amounts of spending in construction in this sector actually increased while the rest of the economy was halted. Not only provided needed medicines, but also helping to secure middle-class employment for skilled union craft workers. In the past, PILMA has undertaken several studies and produced papers on this important connection. We thought it would be important and useful to update our findings on union construction work in the biopharmaceutical industry and even added additional states to our examinations. We've been fortunate to work with the Institute of Construction Economic Resources based at Michigan State. And on hand this afternoon, we've been able to ask the author of the study, ICERIS President Russ Ormiston, to give us an explanation. First, a little bit about ICERIS. The construction industry and its stakeholders face pressing long-term issues regarding workforce sustainability, safety, productivity, and integration of technology. The Institute for Construction Economics Research supports high-quality research with the goal of finding and disseminating pragmatic solutions to these and other construction issues. The Institute undertakes nonpartisan research on issues facing the industry, collaborating with existing construction researchers and attracting new investigators into the field of construction research. The Institute also works to develop a network of researchers with ongoing programs on construction issues. In addition to its work in supporting research, the Institute disseminates this research with a working paper series, a web presence like this, and conferences. Now, just a bit about Russ, and then I'm going to turn over the webinar to the study's author and our favorite professor. Russ is an associate professor of economics at Allegheny College. He's president of the Institute of Construction Economic Research. Russ has a Ph.D. in labor industrial relations at Michigan State University and an MA in economics at Michigan State University. Russ has authored numerous book chapters, academic articles, and public policy papers on the construction industry, including analysis of the economic impact of worker misclassification, prevailing wage laws, project labor agreements, and workplace conditions in the residential construction sector. With that, I'll turn it over to Russ, and he can explain what our findings are and the outcomes of this exciting new study.
All right, thank you, Tim. Welcome, everyone. Glad you guys could be here. Let me share my screen here, and we will get rolling. Tim, quick check. Can you see the screen?
I'm
Am I
right
up and
there.
running?
Thank you.
All right, good stuff. All right, so welcome everybody. Let me get this rolling. There we are. All right, so again, thanks everyone for being here. I appreciate the forum to be able to talk about this. Again, my name is Russ Ormiston, as Tim introduced myself and I-Series. So I'm a professor of economics at Allegheny College in Pennsylvania, and the president of I-Series. And so this report is, Tim and PILMA, came to us and asked for, hey, we need a study given the times that we are in to update, our numbers on what is the relationship, what is the construction spend in the pharma and biotech industry for the last, 5-6 years. And so this is an update to a project we did for PILMA 3 years ago. And given the times that we are in and the space that we are in, we felt it a good time to update that relationship and update kind of what has been going on in the industry over the last 5 or 6 years. And so this report really addresses two specific questions. There's two big areas with which we are, engaged in this report. And the first summarize activity. What is the pharmaceutical and biotech industry? What's it been doing? What kind of infrastructure is being put in place? And so one part of this is to list the projects and to summarize just the overall spend, right? How much infrastructure is being put in place by the private sector in the states that we cover in this piece. So that's a big part of it, is simply summarizing, here are all the projects, here's the big level overall top line spend, what level of investment is the private sector putting into the ground and building up in our communities. The second question, of course, is that if the pharma and biotech industry is building and having a lot of construction work done, a lot of infrastructure is being built, well, that requires skilled tradespeople, across the country to put these in, right? That means a lot of work for union members, for non-union members, really for people who are in this space to build these facilities. And so we want to summarize, well, how much work does this entail? How many labor hours do tradespeople get on these projects, both overall and specifically union hours, and as we'll talk about later, union wages? So what's the kind of economic impact? What's that relationship? How much labor, and specifically union labor, goes on these jobs? And so those are really those two big areas: projects and spending, and then employment and wages. And so the data for this comes from IIR, or you'll hear me reference this a few times in this talk. So Industrial Info Resources. Now this is if any of you are familiar with Dodge data, I know that's kind of a historic, people are familiar with Dodge data. Actually, my late grandfather actually worked selling Dodge data around the country. I didn't know what he did until I got into this space. But if you're familiar with Dodge data, IR is something similar. So they focus specifically on industrial construction. They do it for pharma, manufacturing, energy, and so on and so forth. Very reputable company. They founded in 1983, been around since then, offices around the globe, so on and so forth. So while I don't, this isn't me going out in the field and collecting this data, this comes from a reputable third party. And so that is almost exclusively the data used in the study comes from them. So this data, though, addresses 14 states. And Tim, my internet cut out while you were introducing things, so forgive me if I missed this. But this report covers 14 states, and you see them on the screen in yellow: Washington, Oregon, California, Colorado, Illinois, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Delaware, Connecticut, New York, and Massachusetts. So Tim, I don't know if you want to jump in and explain the reason for
Sure.
these specific states.
Yeah, what we did was we pursued what we kind of off the cuff refer to as a dual density approach. And that is, we wanted to kind of hunt where the ducks were. And that meant we wanted to investigate the jobs where the industry had a presence and where there is a union presence. There are biopharmaceutical startups in other places around the country, but not with enough kind of throwaway to really declare that there's good density here. So so the first measure would be where there's an industry presence, and second, where there's a union construction presence. So that's where we've kind of come up with the economic topography that you see there.
All right, thank you, Tim. So All right. So again, we have data from IIR across 14 states. So again, I want to make sure that we remember that that geography here, that this analysis is across 14 and not 50 states. All right. So what is included? This has been a point of strategy with Tim, Jessica, and I in discussing this project. And we want to be very clear that what's going to come in the next slide, we get to the results here, is we've taken a narrow look at what in this infrastructure is going to be. The private sector, pharma and biotech industry, we're focusing on those bedrock facilities, manufacturing, R&D, warehousing, in specifically the private sector. Now, this was done, again, Tim, you can feel free to correct me if I'm wrong here, but this was done to make sure that to buttress any kind of counterclaims that we're padding our stats, so to speak, right? That we are trying to build in things that aren't really of the industry. So by narrowly focusing it here and keeping those numbers conservative, that criticism falls flat, right? This is the core group of what the industry will do. Now, what is therefore excluded are some things that are related that some might consider to be part of it, but again, kind of in a political defense sort of way. By keeping them out, we have a very defensible list of projects. So what is not included are government projects. So if the FDA is funding a project, that's not going to be included. Standalone office buildings. So if a pharmaceutical company, for whatever reason, wants to build a standalone office building down the street from me, I don't know why you'd want to put it in a residential neighborhood, but so it goes. That's not going to be counted. Hospitals, university R&D, like the picture up there at Michigan State, that's not going to be included. The data actually reveals a lot of cannabis facilities being constructed over the last 5 or 6 years. Those are not included as well, and then supplements and wholesalers. So again, there's a strategic reason for keeping things narrow, but as a result, these things are not included. And again,
Yeah,
Tim,
I would just,
yeah.
Russ, I would just add as a footnote, and some of the rationale for that is that, we're aware that this industry is under a great deal of scrutiny. It's in the public eye a lot. There is a lot of mythology out there, including some notions that the government pays for all of the research that brings the medicine to market. Simply not true. In fact, infinitesimally not true. But so what we wanted to do to avoid any kind of counterclaims, as Russ said, or criticism, is take those jobs off the table. So public-private partnerships or anything not related directly to biopharmaceutical research is not in this study, so that we can make a distilled specific claim about the union construction work that's related to bringing medicines to market to enhance and save people's lives.
Great. Thanks, Tim. So let's get to the results, right? Enough backstory here of what I was doing and where this was going. Let's get to the results. So the first slide is looking at the actual number of projects, right? So again, the $5 million threshold, as far as these projects go, active at any time between 15 and 20. In other words, if a project started in 2013 and finished in June 2015, it's counted. If it started in August 2020 and is slated to finish in August 2023, it's counted. So this is really anything that was active in this 6-year period is counted in the slide below. And so you see the results. And so the IR database, shows 447 projects of $5 million or more, amounting to a total infrastructure, private sector infrastructure spend of $23.6 billion across these 14 states. A few trends to note. First, you see that at least every state has at least $228 million. 7 of the 14 have at least $1 billion. And of course, you see up at the top, Massachusetts and California really have a lot of infrastructure in this industry, 90 to 100 projects, $5.7, $5.8 billion in spend. So, you're probably looking at your respective states on this, but you can see the valuation. There is considerable amount of investment. And as we'll talk about, in a little bit, this is a big jump. I mentioned that we did this study 3 years ago for PILMA, and these numbers have really climbed in the 3 years that, in the 3-year period between these two studies. So these numbers have going up pretty drastically as far as number of projects. That has increased very sharply, and the valuation as well. So we're seeing not only a lot of investment, but a heck of a lot of year-over-year growth in terms of that private sector infrastructure in this industry in these states. So moving along, what are some trends in these projects? So again, we're focused on right now just looking at that specific list of projects. You know, one of the things that jumped out to me that really should be of no, I suspect is of no surprise, but it jumped out to me just the the geographical concentration of these projects, and specifically in the Northeast corridor. So stretching from Washington, D.C. up through Boston. Again, not a huge surprise perhaps, but just seeing it on a screen was really eye-opening a little bit for me. Specifically, and again, maybe not surprised to any of you, but Greater Boston really has a significant concentration of projects. There were about 90 plus that were active at any point in that 6-year period. And you can see that on your screen, that there's just really a hotbed of investment right now. You also see clusters around New York City, Philadelphia, and of course in between up through New Jersey. So a lot of projects. Again, I kind of suspected this, but seeing it visually was really powerful to me. So I think this was something I wanted to share. You notice once you kind of get outside of that, projects start to thin out a little bit. I didn't have this in the PowerPoint, but California, if I showed a map of California, it would show a lot of the same things. You would have a lot of clustering in California, a lot of clustering in, in Los Angeles and San Diego, and also more clustering in the Bay Area. All right. Tim, you there? I saw you jumped offline. You all right? Oh, you're muted. All right. That's all right.
Yeah, fire away. I just grabbed a piece of paper.
No, that's all right. Given that I lost my internet for a couple minutes during your intro, I thought, oh my goodness, maybe I'm lost again. All right, so revisiting these projects and some trends in looking at the data, right? So you saw the list, 447 projects, $23.6 billion. You saw the geographic concentration. What are some trends when I take a step back and look at these projects? First, there are a substantial number of, I don't know how you want to call it, extraordinarily large projects. So there are 13 projects of $300 million or more. Led by a $1.1 billion facility in King of Prussia, PA. You see a picture there, the Center for Breakthrough Medicines. So again, these are rather substantial projects, rather substantial facilities. There were 13 of them. And in almost every state, so in 13 of 14 states, there was at least one $100 million project. And you see the exclusion there is Washington. Looking at the 33 largest, so while there was geographic diversity in these $100 million projects, another trend that revealed itself was that amongst the very largest projects, so the 33 largest, 30 of them were in 5 specific states. And so you see a concentration of the largest of the large, if you will, in these 5 states of Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, Illinois, California, New York. Obviously very populated states, but it was really concentrated in those 5 areas. But, IR data does not just give us what is going on or what has been done, it also looks ahead. And it has projects over the next 5 years. Now, I don't spend a lot of time on that because things do change and projections will change. But the database reveals that concentration that was so distinct over the last 5 years really isn't going to be, or isn't slated to be, or isn't projected to be in place over the next 5. And so you see on the screen that really Michigan, Washington, Colorado, that there are $300 million projects scheduled for each of those 3 states over the next 5 years. So this will really, that trend that I just highlighted really will change over the next 5 years, whether it's in Kalamazoo, Michigan, there's one in Bothell, Washington, Frederick, Colorado. So we're seeing that disperse. Tim, you unmuted yourself. You want to jump in or?
Yeah, a couple of observations, and I think you raised a very good and highly salient point about the projections and with the qualifier that things change. One example of that was last year, a big step up in work in this area because the industry responded with lightning speed to a deadly pandemic. But it's also true, and this is I don't mean to lead the witness, but here's a question for you. It's also true that this is a highly policy sensitive industry, and I know that this is beyond the scope of what you analyzed. But if policies are enacted that deleteriously and highly negatively affect the investment structure profile of the industry, for example, one of the legislative policies that is proposed is projected to take $1 trillion out of the industry over the next 10 years. What's likely to happen to the investment profile? What happens when companies are, face negative circumstances? What happens to construction when something like that occurs?
Yeah, so I will answer, but then also give a non-answer in my best economist way of giving two sides of an answer here. So I don't want to speak to any specific policy just because simply I'm not as plugged into this, and I don't think it's probably wise for me to go on record about policy I'm not intimately familiar with. But obviously a general economic premise, of course, is that if you take away the incentives to do this kind of work, if you take away whatever that financial incentive is to invest, of course, you're going to reduce investment. That's kind of an econ 101 kind of outcome. So that's not very terribly controversial to highlight that. Of course, you're going to see a reduction in incentive investment if the incentive is driven down far enough. Forgive me for not wanting to speak to specific policies. And I know, Tim, you and I have talked about some of these. But, having a conversation and then kind of going on the record publicly with thoughts on policies I'm not as, familiar with, I would hesitate to do that. But I think what you're saying is consistent with basic economic principles.
Well, and I know that's the best I can get. The current, the familiar rant is, if we only had, Harry Truman used to say, if we only had a one-handed economist, then he wouldn't say on the other hand. But it is ipso facto that if you drastically reduce the revenue stream of any industry, one of the first things that stops is building new facilities. That's just the way it is. So I just wanted to kind of put that as a marker there. So go ahead, Russ.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. We've joked often enough about the one-handed economist thing, and I fit the mold whether I like it or not. So. All right. So if you're interested more on the state by state, if you're in Pennsylvania, you're in Michigan, you're in Colorado, and you say, look, I'm really interested in learning more about my specific state and what's going on in my state. As a part of this project, I've created state data lists and state data sheets. So here's the one for Pennsylvania. So if you go on the PILMA website, you'll be able to access this for your respective state, and you see a lot of the details there, the top 10 projects. You'll see a map of your state, of where these projects are located, the number of projects, their valuations, and some more employment numbers that we're going to get into in a second. So again, I'm not going to go through each state. That would take all day. But if you are interested in learning more, the PILMA website does have that available. Go ahead and download those, and you can use those to whatever means that you need. So let's turn the page a little.
Just a quick question from the audience. One of our ironworker friends in Washington, Lee Nugent, asked a good question, and I don't have the answer to it, and I'm not sure that you do, but Lee will try to dig that up to you. Lee asked the question, is there any data that suggests the delta between research and manufacturing facilities? Is the cost of one particular facility more than the other? The only thing I would say is that the custody of care and the science that is required for both requires high level of technology and intricacy in both settings. But I'm not so sure, Russ, that we've been able to parse between research and manufacturing.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of the data itself. There are going to be different ways to categorize it. Whether we can give a clean split between manufacturing and R&D, I'm a little bit unsure. I'm skeptical of. I'm not saying it can't be done, but I'm a little skeptical of being able to do that. I think it's a fantastic question. and something that we can kind of put our heads on this later. But I don't do it in the reports. And again, I'm skeptical with the current data that we have it in, whether we could do that, whether we could sit down with each of these 447 and throw them into different buckets and then start, making decisions from there. That is something that's possible. But as far as what I've done to this point, no, because it really does not, it's not a clean cut in the data to allow that to happen, but it's a great question.
Great. Thanks, Lee. We'll try to dig that information up for you. As you know, in these both in the research and in manufacturing settings, every molecule in every room has to be accounted for because of the dangerous gases, the levels of material, and the intricacy which every both on the research side and on the manufacturing side require. We've often said, and the numbers have changed, but the first pill or the first dose costs somewhere around $2 billion. The second one costs a little less than that because the research is plowed into that product. But it is true that that highly technical care has to be carried all the way to the shelf. So it's a good question, and thank you for it.
No, thank you. All right, so actually we were right in between sections here. So let me kind of bring us back up to speed and where we are. So that last couple of slides, we're looking at specifically project lists, right? And so if we think about we having a project list, now we want to transition to saying, what is that overall spend, right? Specifically between January 1 of 15 and December 31st of 2020, what was the total amount of expenditures? And so we have to make some tweaks to what we have done so far and kind of add some things onto it for a few reasons. First, there we go. First, I mentioned when I introduced projects that if they started before 15 and ended after 20, then that was fine. Well, if we're trying to isolate spending in that 6-year window, we need to remove the spending of anything of these projects before 15 and anything scheduled after 2020. And so we need to isolate just the spending on those projects in that 6-year period. So that's a wrinkle we have to address. Second, IIR, just like any firm that does this kind of work, whether it's Dodge, whether it's whatever, you're not going to get every project. That's a practical impossibility to be aware of every single construction project in the country. Things are going to slip through the cracks. Some startup might show up and you don't know what they're doing. That's going to happen. So IR is aware of that as well. I'll get to what they do about it here in a second. So we have to incorporate the error term, if you will, things we might miss. And lastly, the $5 million threshold removes, of course, all the construction that happens on smaller projects, things less than 5 million. So if we put these three issues together, right, we have to incorporate some wrinkles based on starting with the projects as the starting point, but then building in this nuance and building in this extra stuff to come up with an overall spending number. And so to do that, IR has a proprietary algorithm that incorporates these three things, right? They have a lot of information on each specific project. They can figure out, how much is in 2015 versus 2014. They have all, I've tried to crack the code with them. I've had some conversations with their analysts trying to get more at their algorithm, but it truly is proprietary. So I do not know what's under the hood, but I know the car runs, and in talking to them, I recognize they're taking great pains to do good work on this. So again, third party, but a very reputable third party when it comes to these issues. So their proprietary algorithm is going to address, how much total spending given those three issues on the side, starting from the project list. And so to get into the results, like what is the annual spending across 14 states in the private sector, pharmaceutical and biotech industry? And so you see the results on the screen. A little warning popped up on my screen. So what we look at here is that in 2015, spending was $3.9 billion across these 14 states. And you will notice a few trends. First, you notice year-over-year growth. So 3.9 billion becomes 4.2 billion and so on up and through 2020, and you see 6.1 billion. So that is a substantial increase in spending. If you think about 2015 as the base, That's about a 50% increase over time, between 15 and 20. So it's a considerable growth, far outpacing any kind of concerns about inflation or anything like that, that there is considerable amounts of investment growth over this time. Now, one of the things that jumped out to me, because I didn't know where the numbers were going to take this before I started it, obviously, is, the narrative that I'm hearing just as a general layperson, not day to day involved in pharma and biotech is, oh, well, all the investment is vaccine related, it's COVID related. That really and truly does not bear out in the data. I want to make that crystal clear. One of the big things that really, caught my attention is that jump between 2018 and 2019, right? There is a substantial jump of almost $1 billion between the 2 years. This is effectively predating the pandemic, right? And you see another big jump in 2020. To me, this is a clear sign that any kind of narrative that's out there that this is all pandemic driven and is going to crash back to earth afterwards, really, the data is not reflecting that. This is growing and growing very fast and has been doing so for quite some time. Looking ahead, got to get myself back on this. There we go. Looking ahead, I mentioned that IR data does allow some look ahead. Now, I don't, for reasons I get into in a second, I don't spend a lot of time in the report looking ahead, but IR data is projecting that number is going to jump up to 6.5 billion this year and then remain above 5.2 billion through 2025. And so that 5.2 seems like a step down, but one, if you look at 2018, 17, 16, that's still considerable growth. And the other thing to be mindful of, I mentioned that we did this report 3 years ago, and I went back to the data from 3 years ago to look at their projections, IR's projections for 18, 19, and 20, and they were far lower than what actually happened. So, when they say 5.2 billion, obviously I don't want to, I'm sure they're doing good modeling and good approaches, but they significantly underaccounted what was going to happen. And it happens. They're trying to project the future. Things change, as Tim mentioned. So, but nevertheless, even with that, they're projecting 5.2 billion a year. So could it be higher? It could be much higher. I think it's too early to know that.
One of the questions, Russ, I think we'll rely on our member company folks, and we'll get back to folks on that question, is because of I would suggest and have heard, it's the nature of the science and the science of discovery. There's a thing called the difference between small molecule and large molecule compounds. As we know, this industry has galloped into the future with stunning science. The mRNA alone has manifold applications for a great many other disease states. And there's policy questions about that are beyond the purview of this webinar. But one of the things that the industry has responded with is investment to grapple with this highly complicated science. The introduction of biological integers into the application of medicine is changing medicine entirely. And the industry has responded with investment in new, robust facility management to respond to the evolution of the science and the industry. So that's one answer, and I know that our company folks will be able to provide more.
Yeah, so a little heads up. So I got a message from the moderator here. We've got 10 minutes remaining here, so I think I should push forward here to get into the rest of this. As far as spending by state, I'm throwing up a lot of numbers at you. You're all going to maybe necessarily gravitate to your specific state and look at it. Obviously, there's too many numbers there for me to go over each one, but it highlights, one, that the data in the report is there if you want to look at your state and how things have evolved over time. But there's really a couple main takeaways from looking at state by state totals. First, and really here's the big reveal in terms of spending, is that over that 6-year period across these 14 states, the private sector pharma industry put up $29 billion of infrastructure just in that 6-year period. So that is a big number, and even knowing, as we mentioned right up front, that we're being knowingly narrow with our choice of projects. it's still $29 billion in spending. Another thing to note is that that increase you saw on the previous slide, by and large, manifests itself at the state level. It's not one-to-one. There's some unevenness, some up and down in some states, but by and large, we're seeing increases in almost all states on a year-over-year basis. So to move it forward, again, for the sake of time, some trends that show up first in terms of growth, comparing 2020 to 2015, 4 states saw substantial amounts of growth in terms of 200 million or more on an annual basis. And you see those there. So Pennsylvania, New York, Massachusetts, Illinois. So that's kind of the largest growth in terms of dollar amounts. In terms of percentages, the numbers are very clear that there's been massive growth on a percentage basis in the Pacific Northwest. So Oregon, Washington, I know they're kind of at the bottom on the table at left, but that kind of hides that there's been a lot of spending over the last few years compared to what it was in 15 and 16. So considerable amounts of growth in the industry up in the Pacific Northwest. As far as capital expenses, in other words, what we're seeing when you break down the data as far as what this construction looks like, we're able to identify how much of it is capital expenses, in other words, new buildings, new projects versus MRO, which is maintenance, repair, and overhaul. So capital expenses, new buildings, are actually a considerable portion of spending in Massachusetts specifically. A lot of new buildings, a lot of new facilities, Illinois and Maryland as well. But maintenance, repair, and overhaul of existing facilities, presumably, that is much higher in California and New Jersey. And lastly, again, we're seeing that stranglehold of those 5 big states, but that really is projected to change over the next 5 years. You see investments in Colorado, Michigan, Ohio, and Connecticut, New Jersey as well. So again, we're seeing that diversity, that geographic diversity, really starting to manifest itself over the next 5 years as well. So the industry is not just growing, it's growing in places that maybe were less concentrated in previous years. All right, for the sake of time, again, I hate to be quick, but moving into employment, I know that many on this call are either union folks or somehow related to that area. So I want to get to this notion of employment, that if we think about all this spending and all this projects, the question is, well, what does this mean for jobs, right? Tradespeople. How many jobs does this industry support? How many hours of work are on these projects? What's the value here if you're in the skilled trades? And so IR, again, proprietary algorithm, been enough of these calls with them to try to peel back the onion, but I'm not getting very far. But they use an algorithm to try to estimate the number of labor hours by state, by year for 14 trades. Right, so we're not counting the staff. We're not counting if there's other people not in these trades involved. It's just the 14 trades. And one thing that we're going to come back to, even in the time we have, is that there's no data in this on union, non-union. As much as Tim and I, and maybe almost everybody, would love to have a clean union, non-union split in the data, how many of these hours are union folks, how many of them are not, the data simply isn't there. That IR just does not collect that. So we're going to have to, I do some kind of, some work to try to estimate it, but I want to be clear right up front, the hard data that I have does not have union totals.
Yeah, and I would just add at the jump, because that's an important thing for us to completely embrace and understand. Once more, these are lower bound numbers because we're using that algorithm based on density per state. That's not to mean that in some states, the algorithm might use a percentage for us of say 39%, but many of these facilities are built 100% union. We know that because of our own personal experience. We just can't extract that data because even in Dodge reports, you can't tell which company and contractor is union versus non-union over the course of time. So we use the algorithm to demonstrate that at least this number is in effect. But as I mentioned, in places like you've already mentioned, Pennsylvania, Oregon, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, many of those projects are north of 95% union construction work. I just had to make sure that that was well understood.
Yeah, and I'm gonna get an algorithm here in a minute. So I don't want to confuse the issue that what you're staring at on the screen here is total hours. This isn't union, non-union. We haven't got to that point yet. So I want, before we get there, I want to highlight that these are just all hours, all workers, union, non-union. This is what IR is projecting. So you see that the industry has required over the last 6 years 58.7 million labor hours across these 14 trades. It's a hell of a lot of hours. And you see, obviously, the top three: electricians, instrumentation techs, plumbers, and pipe fitters. They necessitate about well over 60% of those hours. And of course, you can look at your respective trades there as well. Again, all of this data, everything that I'm reviewing here is in the report. So if you're jotting things down fast, it's all there. Over time, just as we saw the growth of spending between 15 and 20, you're seeing a similar growth in employment. To be expected, right? More activity, more work, more employment. So you're seeing a 50% jump in hours worked from 15 to 20, from 7.96 million hours to 12.31 million hours last year across just these 14 states. Now, to get into union labor, I will throw this up quickly. Tim kind of gave a good introduction here. Obviously, one of our primary considerations is how much of this is union work. And I share your desire to know that answer after working on these projects. Unfortunately, IR data does not have it, as I mentioned before. So we kind of have to come up with a way to estimate it. And as Tim mentioned, we know that in many cases, these projects are 100% union. But data-wise, we don't have the hard data on that, right? That's from my perspective, that unless I know every project and I know the union stat, and it's not in the data, I can't make those claims. So the policy, from a policy perspective and conversations with John Q. Lawmaker, whoever it is, we need to come up with a defensible way of estimating this in a way that, PILMA or myself or whoever is not going to be criticized and saying, well, you're just padding your numbers, right? You're just making stuff up. You're padding your numbers. That's an accusation that, as an economist specifically, I want no part of, and I don't think it's good politically for Tim and then Jessica and the like. And so the solution here is kind of a common economic one, and it's as Tim said, it's very conservative and very lower bound, again, as a means to buttress against any kind of counterclaim against the study. And this is to use, I use census data to estimate the union density in non-residential construction by state, right? So there are some ways that I can go in and use census data to figure out in the non-residential sector what proportion of workers are unionized. Now, this isn't an exact approach, and I know that this is going to sound low, right? Because if you think about non-residential, that's going to include pharmaceutical research facilities. It's also going to include your local Walmart, right? And so we know that if you put all these together, there's a heck of a lot more union workers on a pharma plant than there's going to be building your local Denny's, right? It's not even close. That average, it's a lower bound, right? It's the average across all those types of facilities. And so we go into this knowing it's lower bound, but it's a very defensible approach. It's conservative, and we can't be criticized for padding our stats. All right, so there's kind of what Tim was referring to, and in terms of the algorithm, that middle column really is the result of the algorithm of trying to get at a proportion of non-union, of union, non-residential. Again, it's an estimate in each state. So if you think the number might be higher or lower, the algorithm is imperfect, but it is using census data to the best of an economist's ability to get at that proportion. And so we take the number of hours per state, run it through that number, saying, hey, 38% in California of non-residential is unionized. There's the number, right? So 5.7. Is it low? Yes, but it's defensible, right? From an economist perspective, that is, using census data to estimate these things is, I don't want to say unassailable, because nothing's unassailable in economics, but it's as defensible as we can get it. And so if you put this all together, you run this through, union hours, 22.3 million union hours. And again, that is likely undercount. As far as union earnings, 774 million. Now, where is that coming from? Multiply union hours in a state times the average union construction worker wage in the state. even that's going to be low, because all I can get to, given how much data is in the census, is the overall union numbers. If you're hiring high wage workers, higher wage trades, which if you saw that slide a few slides ago, you probably are, it's probably higher than the average. But all of this is defensible politically. If this is thrown in front of a lawmaker, I'm comfortable putting my name on this and saying, hey, here's some numbers, but they're lower bound. This doesn't even include benefits, right? The amount of money that goes into health insurance and retirement. That number in the census is, I don't want to say unreliable. There's just not as much data there for me to build a model on. So you put all this together and it's still a big number, right? 22 million hours, $774 million in wages. But it's a very defensible thing to put out there publicly, that I will put my name behind. Last but not least, and I'll let Tim jump in, I know we're pushing time here, is that, the question of the project 3 years ago was apprenticeship programs. One of the real valuable public policy initiatives tied with union labor is that workforce development piece, right? That if you go in front of a lawmaker and say, look, we're pouring private money into workforce development and building skills and building the next generation of skilled tradespeople, this is a valuable conversation. And so if we just assume just 30 cents per hour, which I know it differs by trade, but even if we just assume 30 cents per union labor hour, and we assume a very low 22 million labor hours amongst union workers, we're talking, a minimum of $6.7 million being pumped into joint apprenticeship training programs. I think we're out of time, so I don't know how much time wants to talk about it, but that's a valuable number in thinking about, apprenticeships and workforce development and stuff that doesn't require any public money or any student debt. That's a valuable piece.
Yeah, I would just add a note, and we're okay.
Conclusion.
We're okay with time.
I'll turn it back. Okay.
Let me just add, Russ, let me just add that just on this apprenticeship piece, our union folks that are skilled craft union folks that are on this webinar know how this works. It's a kind of an undertold story. PILMA has applauded the Biden administration in recognizing the value in workforce development with registered apprentice programs. PILMA, together with our brothers and sisters in the building trades, took a strong stand last year when there were efforts in the Trump administration to water down registered apprentice programs. One of the things that's ontologically clear is that with this remarkable workforce development program, the business model requires a job to go with the apprentice program. If there's not any construction work, there's no apprentice program because they go hand in hand. That's how through journeyman hours and apprentice hours, that's how these programs are funded. So the industry's investment in these job sites where they put union contractors to work helps develop the next generation of construction workers, not only for the site that they're working on, but after they're finished on biopharmaceutical and other industry sites into the future. So I just had to throw that commercial in.
Thanks, Tim. You see the conclusions. I was going to draw this out here, but we're pushing time a little bit here. So you see the primary conclusions of the 447 projects, $29 billion in spending. And again, I want to circle back to that third point. The growth predated the pandemic, substantial amounts in these 14 states, and should stay consistent. Again, long-term projections are always a little bit, you don't want to put too much weight on long-term estimates because we've seen the world does change, but it looks to be very strong overall. And again, of course, the 58 million labor hours we mentioned at the beginning. So, I'm at the conclusion. Tim, I don't know if you want to have any follow-up remarks. If there's questions, I'm happy to stick around. Tim, I'll kind of throw the show back to you to kind of run point here.
Well, I would add, we're not done. And what I mean by that is we're looking for more ways to create even more opportunity with the industry and the skilled union craft workers that are part of this industry. We applaud member companies who adopt responsible contracting provisions. We know that many of the companies pay at least or more than prevailing wage in many of these projects. Many companies have responsible contracting principles that require contractor subsidized or contractor funded healthcare plans for their workers. That narrows the field for the skilled union contractors who are able to provide benefits that keep and maintain middle-class income for union construction workers and their families. This study ratifies those findings, but it doesn't mean, like I said, we're done. Our member company CEOs, as well as member union general presidents, have met together to explore ways to look for additional opportunities for this kind of work. And we're hoping that maybe a few years from now, when we ask Russ to do another study, that we can show that that kind of representative growth. So thank you, Russ, and thank you all for joining. If you do have questions, feel free to email us and we can track down the answer for you. But we're excited about these findings. We're excited to look for new and different ways to talk to them. And we appreciate you taking part in this webinar.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks.